Hello to all our viewers, and welcome to the session we have put together for those interested in migrating to New Zealand under an investment or entrepreneur visa. I am Sarah Crome, and I'm a licensed advisor at New Zealand Shores, and I specialise in investment and entrepreneur visas. I'm joined by my colleague Charlotte Stockman, who also specialises in investment visas, particularly the parent retirement visas, which we will be touching on later in the session. We are also joined by lauryn.goh and Jason Watson from JMI Wealth. So Jason is the head of advice at JMI Wealth and has more than 25 years experience in financial markets around the world, New Zealand, Europe, Australia. And he's also worked with many banks in New Zealand, including ANZ Private, BNZ and ASB, to name a few. So in addition to Jason, we've got lauryn, also an investment advisor with more than 15 years experience in the financial services industry. And that's in New Zealand and Singapore. And lauryn has also worked as a private banker as well in some of New Zealand's leading banks. So JMI Wealth is one of our partner agencies that we like to align with to ensure our clients are given the best service. Jason and lauryn have a wealth of knowledge, so it's great to have them with us. Thank you, guys. And it's going to be interesting to hear them talk today, and I'm sure you'll be taking away some really useful insights as to the New Zealand investment market. So just today, we will be covering in the session the visa categories available to you, and just quickly work through the eligibility criteria for some of those. We won't go in depth, we'll touch on the main points for eligibility. And Jason and lauryn will talk us through the New Zealand economy and market, the effects that COVID has had, and how they assist our clients, our investment clients, particularly with their investment portfolios. So Charlotte, over to you.
Thanks for that introduction, Sarah. To get started, can you just give us an overview of the investor branch within Immigration New Zealand, what the processing of investor applications is looking like since COVID, what impacts has COVID really had on that process for migrants?
Yeah, so we'll start off with the Investor 2 category. That is the most common visa category for investment. So prior to lockdown, the last EOI selection that Immigration had was on the 12th of March, and they selected 5 EOIs from that pool. So that was before lockdown. The first selection after lockdown was on the 5th of June, and they selected 38 EOIs, so an increase in demand of 600%, which is quite amazing. So what's contributed to that? Of course, the EOI pool being closed for 3 months, obvious factor. But what we've also seen is since that first selection back after lockdown, there has continued to be a higher number of EOIs submitted. So again, what's the cause for that? I think undoubtedly New Zealand's response to COVID, and that's been praised around the world. And other factors, we've got unstable political environments, particularly in the US, and economic recovery concerns for the likes of some of our markets in South Africa. This makes New Zealand more attractive, given we're relatively free, safe environment, and the fact that we as well started off from an economically sound position before lockdown, which is very positive. So going back to the investor branch and their processing, even though they selected EOIs again in June, they did not start inviting people to apply for residence until September this year, so a bit of a delay. They have advised they'll be working through onshore applications first before going to any offshore applications, and that's just given their limited capacity, given the increase in demand that they've seen. So in terms of processing times, looking to be around 12 months at the moment. There's also been an increase in the Investor 1 applications. Oh, sorry, you're right, Charlotte. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm all right. I'm not talking.
Okay. Increase in Investor One applications. And again, immigration will be processing applicants that are onshore first before then moving to offshore applications. I think the good thing is immigration do understand the fact that, you know, being able to facilitate that foreign investment right now is crucial in terms of aiding the, you know, recovery post-COVID. So they have made investor applications their priority since lockdown, which is awesome. And in terms of the border, this is obviously still closed unless you are considered a critical or essential worker. Or if you are the family or partner of a New Zealand citizen or resident, or of a temporary visa holder already living here in New Zealand. The situation at the border is still very fluid. Many of you watching this will know that we have an election in this weekend. And it's expected that once the election has passed, then we will start to see more proactiveness from the government in relaxing border requirements and starting to facilitate more people through. So yeah, quick update as to what we're noticing with the Border Act current and the investor branch.
Awesome, thanks so much, Sarah. I'm not sure what happened there. There must have been a bit of feedback, but anyway, onwards. Lauren and Jason, a question for you. Can we get an overview of the New Zealand economy and the market at the moment? And also the points of difference that clients coming from other markets experience, be that China, the US, Europe. What's the difference between those markets and here?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte, and Sarah, thanks as well. So it's been a really interesting time, and actually Sarah touched on a few things, and I might just expand on some of those as well. But we really haven't seen something like this before in regards to the response that we've seen not only domestically in New Zealand, but globally. And it's almost like a pioneering situation. So the forecast of what people are expecting is a little bit of a finger in the air, so they've got no reference to work off. But if we just look at it at a high level, New Zealand is doing really well. We've got very low rates of COVID in the country. We've got no community transmission. We are open, and so New Zealanders are able to move around freely. All of the bars and restaurants, etc., are open. And some of you may have seen we had one of the first live sporting events last weekend where they had 30-odd thousand people in the stadium. So very good. And also just recently the government announced that we may be opening the border up to our trans-Tasman neighbour Australia, which is very significant, as Australia is one of our largest tourism countries and is positive for that part of the industry. Again, unemployment it's not as high as it was first forecast, and it's expected at the moment it's around about 6%. We started off in a really good place at around 4%, 4.5%. It's forecast to go up to about 8% in 2021 and then coming back down again. GDP, not as bad as forecast, so that's expected to bounce back strongly in 2021. And also the housing market, which is a big influence on how New Zealand economy goes generally, because most New Zealanders own their homes, and there's a perceived wealth effect as we see the price of houses go up. New Zealand has historically been very expensive when it comes to purchasing houses, and there's various reasons for that, but New Zealanders have always had an affinity with home ownership. Sarah talked about the election, and what we do expect is that the existing government will stay. The interesting thing will be whether they will govern alone or whether they will have to create a coalition similar to what they had to do in the last election. But at the moment, the polls are saying that they may be able to govern alone. That's not, whatever happens, it's not going to be a large influencer on the general market, and both major political parties are very similar in their policies anyway, and all that they're pointing towards is stimulus for the economy to get us through this next sort of 6 to 12 months, and then obviously there'll be a whole new ball game around what is the the government debt going to look like, and what have they spent the money on, and hopefully that's moving into things like infrastructure spend, etc. But Sarah made a good point that the New Zealand government balance sheets were in very good shape. So even with the incredible stimulus that the government provided, that was a lot around wage subsidies, we don't have a lot of government debt when you compare it on a GDP per capita basis for the rest of the world. So there is a lot of leg room or headroom that the government has for additional stimulus. Now, what the other thing, and this is most probably answering your question, Charlotte, is around what are we sort of seeing, or the points of difference. Now, this isn't a point of difference in regards to the incredibly low interest rates we're seeing, because we've seen that around the world. But what we have seen from a New Zealand perspective is we've never seen interest rates this low. New Zealand has historically been a high interest rate country. Our interest rates are, you could, if you went back 5 to 10 years ago, your term deposits would have been 4 to 6%. They're now going to be about 1% before any taxes. So that's a completely different environment that New Zealand's seen. And what the Reserve Bank of New Zealand have said is that they expect that they will keep these interest rates at these low levels for a very long period of time. And we're talking 3 to 5 years and even longer. So that's going to create some different behaviors around investors. So you've got people who rely on those historically high, compared to the rest of the world, bank term deposit rates, which were very safe, are now having to say, how can I create an income? And so we're seeing more money flowing into shares, and also you are seeing the property market, as well as some people are looking to invest. But the property market doesn't really create you a very good yield. It's got no liquidity, obviously, for the retirees to draw income. So a lot of money is moving into the share market. This may seem odd also for offshore people, but we've never had really a superannuation scheme for New Zealanders until about 10, maybe 15 years ago. Something called KiwiSaver started up. And it was very small to start with, and it's growing momentum. We've got a really small New Zealand share market. And as an example, our top 50 stocks is generally what everyone talks about. So when you compare Australia, there's 200. When you compare the US, it's 500. So we've got 50. And it's even more of a situation of small when you come out of the top 10 stocks. So the market cap of about the 11th largest company in New Zealand is about 4 billion. So when you look at that globally, that's almost a micro cap stock. So it's a small market. It's pretty thin in regards to the industries as well. So we don't have a big presence in things like technology, healthcare. We do have some companies in there, but we're talking one or two. Finance, so the banks, we've got one New Zealand bank that's listed, and then we've got 2 Australian banks that have New Zealand branches are listed, and then resource companies. So it's a pretty thinly traded market, a thinly diversified market. But what we do have a lot of is infrastructure stocks that pay, and high dividend paying stocks. So if I go back to my comment about term deposits at 1%, we're seeing a lot of people moving money into those type of companies that can pay you a net dividend of around 4 to 6%. And in a low growth environment, they're looking pretty attractive, and we're seeing a lot of money flowing into those. So so New Zealand has historically been a dividend company, a dividend index. But what we're seeing lately is we've had some higher growth companies in there. Fisher & Paykel Healthcare that makes has respiratory technology, and then our other large company is A2 Milk, which is very much around the agri sector of exporting milk, etc. So we've seen a lot of people moving money from cash and term deposits into the market, but being a quite small market, that has having an impact. The performance has been very good. The market is now above pre-COVID levels. and we expect that to continue as more investors look for how they can generate an income. So hopefully that gives you a really high-level overview of how New Zealand's going.
Yeah, that was really great. Thank you. I think you've almost sort of touched on my next question, which was, can you explain how COVID has affected the New Zealand financial markets and investment behaviour? But you've already talked about people moving from banks to investing in shares and things. But are there any trends you are seeing, or what do you foresee for the future?
Yeah, so what we saw is we've just come through company announcements, most probably about a month ago, 2 months ago, and as expected around the world as well, is that the company announcements were not great compared to the previous years, but actually not as bad as what the analysts had forecast. And so we didn't really see the same sort of drop that we did around some other global indices. And as I said, we've now rebounded back from those lows. The government has been very active around creating low interest rate environment, and that is having an impact twofold. New Zealand has quite an active bond market, and so you can actually buy corporate and government bonds on the listed markets. And as you can imagine, we have low interest rates, and the bonds are now returning you pretty much, for the first time, we had negative rates in New Zealand. So the wholesale money market rates, the swap rates, the shorter end went negative for the first time we've seen in our lifetimes. And you're getting incredibly low returns from there. If you look at a client's portfolio, and this is the investor behavior situation, is a balanced portfolio has 50% of their holdings in cash and bonds and 50% in shares and growth assets. Well, if you're returning or seen to be returning pretty much zero in one half of your portfolio, what we're seeing is more people actually moving to take more risk. And I think that's something quite relevant when people are talking about the investor category as well, because people are going to, if they want to create a return, that's coming from shares. If they want to create stability in their portfolio, the capital of their portfolio, obviously that's in cash and bonds, but that's going to return zero. Okay, so what we're seeing that is feeding through into the wider market of not just, like I said, term deposits, but you're seeing investors saying, well, what can I do? I need to create an income. Retirees, I need an income. How can I get that? Where can I get that? And that's forcing more people into the market. And so a lot of the dividend yielding stocks, we have a thing called the gentailers over here. So a lot of the electricity generators and providers of New Zealand market, it's quite large. It's about 30% of our market. They pay pretty attractive dividends of, around that 5 and 6%. So we're seeing a lot of people, and literally 50% of that is government owned. So some people may call that quasi-government. We're seeing a lot of money flowing into there as a fairly safe haven as well. So that's a little bit around that investor behaviour.
Awesome. So thank you so much for that. You've given us a really comprehensive overview of everything. Sarah, can you give us an overview now of the business and investment applications and how perhaps some of our clients could look to utilise some of what Jason's just spoken about?
Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, Jason. I certainly learned a lot from that. It sounds like the perfect storm at the moment too, with those really low interest rates, like you say, just forcing a lot more investors into the market. So obviously going to be good for the economic recovery, which is awesome. So if we just talk very briefly now about the main investment visas that New Zealand has on offer. So we have 2 investor visas, the first being the Investor 1 category, and that requires investment of 10 million New Zealand dollars. Secondly, there is the Investor 2 category, and that requires investment of 3 million New Zealand dollars. We also have a business visa called the Entrepreneur Visa, and that's for those In most situations, it is for those who don't meet the investor thresholds and looking to otherwise do business in New Zealand. Lastly, I will briefly talk through the parent retirement visa as well, and that's for those parents or grandparents looking to join an adult child who is either a resident or citizen of New Zealand. So if we touch on the Investor 1 category first, so you require 10 million New Zealand dollars to invest in New Zealand, and that investment duration is for 3 years. You have a time spent requirement, and that is that you must live in New Zealand for at least 88 days over the last 2 years of that 3-year investment period. And that is only the principal applicant that must live in New Zealand for those 88 days. Other family members included do not need to spend any time in New Zealand as long as they simply activate their visa. There is no requirement for anyone to have business experience. There is no age limit. There is no English language requirements for a principal applicant or family members. There is, of course, health and character requirements that you must be in good health, have no major health conditions that's going to put any cost or demand on the New Zealand healthcare system. And of course, you must be of good character. So immigration policy states that the acceptable investments, or the funds you're using to invest in New Zealand, must be in an investment that is capable of a commercial return. It's not for personal use. And it is actually one of the most flexible investment criteria in the first world countries. So we're very lucky in that sense. Investment must be made in New Zealand dollars, and it must be in New Zealand. So the types of things that your investment can include can be residential property development, commercial property, company shares, equities, and government bonds. And we'll get Jason and Lauren to just sort of touch on an ideal investment portfolio shortly. Moving on to the Investor 2 category, and that is investment of 3 million New Zealand dollars. The duration for which that must be invested in New Zealand is over 4 years. And at the 4-year mark, just like at the 3-year mark with the Investor 1, you're then given a permanent resident visa, and you can withdraw those funds out as you wish. While your money is invested in New Zealand, you are entitled to take the returns and use that as you wish. So you do get access to those dividends. They don't need to be reinvested. There is a requirement under the Investor 2 category that you must have at least 3 years business experience. And the definition of what business experience is very strict. So you must have either had management level experience or ownership in a company that is turning over 1 million New Zealand dollars or has at least 5 full-time employees. So that is a requirement for the Investor 2 category, and you must have a minimum of 3 years business experience. The age limit for the Investor 2 category is 65, so the principal applicant must be 65 years of age or younger. There's also health and character requirements as well, and there are English language requirements. So the principal applicant must have a level of English comparable to an IELTS level 3. Family members that are included can pre-purchase English tuition if they are unable to meet the English language threshold. So moving on, again, the definition of acceptable investments is the same as the Investor 1 category. However, under the Investor 2 category, if an applicant is nominating to spend half of their nominated investment into growth investments, then they're going to qualify for a 500,000 discount. So that brings the total amount down of investment required to 2.5 million. This will also have an effect on the time that they spend in New Zealand and relaxing those rules, which is a benefit. So while we're touching on acceptable investments, Lauren and Jason, if I can just bring you back in here, how would you normally construct your investment portfolios for our clients? And Could you perhaps describe one that JMI Wealth has recently done and how you look to manage that portfolio given those constraints that we have with immigration in terms of what is an acceptable investment and what isn't?
Yeah, so once you have been approved by Immigration New Zealand, normally the client will have an approval in principle letter. So firstly, we will look at the mandated requirement within the approval in principle letter for the 3 or 4 years, depending on the investor category type. And for instance, like you have mentioned, Sarah, for the category 2 client, if the client invests half into growth assets, then they might get a financial discount. So it's important for us to look at what has been stipulated in the approval in principle letter. So that's one. And secondly, we're working with the client on their risk profile, and we want to understand more about their personal needs and their investment goals, what else they'd like to achieve beyond the investment period of the 3 or 4 years. So it's really important for us to have a good understanding of what else they're trying to achieve and their risk profile. So in line with that, then we will actually customize an acceptable investment portfolio on a holistic approach, working in with our JMI Wealth investment philosophy and governance as well. So just to give you an example of a most recent Investor Plus client, he had a 55% to growth and 45% into bonds allocation because of his risk profile, of his goals, and also to want to take advantage of market movements. So for bonds, typically we will look for high quality companies with very strong credit rating. I know that in Immigration New Zealand guideline, it has to be BBB rated and above, but for us, we tend to look at even better quality than that, such as A-. So they're highly liquid, they're traded on the secondary market, and we will have a range of different investment terms and tenors. For shares, we'll look at high quality listed companies as well on the New Zealand Stock Exchange. Most importantly, we're quite flexible when it comes to customizing the portfolio for the client, which actually fulfills the requirement of Immigration New Zealand. And so another process that we do as well is that we liaise with Immigration New Zealand on the client's behalf for them to have a look at, this is what we're going to put through. Are you happy with that? And once we get the endorsement, then we will do the trades accordingly. So that's another step that we do as well to ensure compliance under the terms of acceptable investments. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks, Lauren. That was great. So, so that's the 2 investor categories. We've got to move quickly. I think we're starting to push time. So just lastly, the business visa I'll talk about, the entrepreneur category, work visa, and that is for anyone wanting to undertake business in New Zealand. And that business venture may be purchasing an existing business, investing into an existing business, or starting up a business from scratch. So it's a little bit confusing, this visa category. If you read the eligibility criteria on the immigration website, it's a little bit misleading. It is a points-based system. You need 120 points to qualify. And this includes things like points for age, business experience, capital investment, creation of employment, annual export turnover. Where in reality, what we notice from immigration is the bottom line is for them, this business needs to create significant benefit to the country. So what immigration are looking at, obviously job creation is a big one for them, capital investment, whether it's a new product or service you're going to be creating, or transforming an industry already here in New Zealand. So there is a high decline rate. They do decline more visas than they approve. And that's just traditionally, they've had people come through with passive business proposals, essentially trying to buy themselves a job and get through New Zealand that way. So success for this visa category, 100% down to what is the significant benefit that your business venture is going to provide to New Zealand. So not one that is for the lighthearted. You're spending a lot of time and money in New Zealand without the certainty that you're going to get a resident visa at the end of that period. So yeah. I won't touch on the parent retirement category. It is for those who have a child in New Zealand who is going to be able to support their stay. You must have $1 million to invest here. You must have an additional $500,000 in settlement funds to bring with you, and you must have an annual income of $60,000. We can touch on this later. Viewers are welcome to contact us about this visa category. I just realized that we're starting to run out of time, so I'll skip over that one. But I think we're going to go back to you, Lauren and Jason, just quickly. For those, let's call them retirees, that are looking to invest $1 million into New Zealand for the purpose of getting a parent retirement visa. Can you tell us perhaps what you would do differently for these types of applicants, as opposed to how you would treat an investor who's got 3 or 10 million to invest here?
Well, I would say that it wouldn't be too much of a difference, because it all comes down to the client's risk tolerance and needs. So retirement clients, they might have lower tolerance to risk, and that means low returns. And for us, it's very much about the clients and how they feel about the markets and their needs. So and whether they want income as well from the investment. We'll customize the portfolio accordingly to suit and what is stipulated in the Immigration New Zealand requirements in the approval in principle letter.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. Oh, I've just lost my screen. Okay, so I think that's going to wrap for us now. Thanks everyone for logging in and watching. We will be popping this webinar on our Facebook page as well as YouTube. Lauren and Jason, thanks so much for joining us. That was awesome, and I learned a lot. And it's very interesting times, isn't it, for the financial markets? Sounds around the world, and a bit of a perfect storm. New Zealand's looking very, very attractive right now down here in the bottom of the world. So we're expecting that there is going to be even more demand next year when the borders open. So interesting to see what happens. Lauren and Jason have kindly offered to give us their email addresses to make public. So we will be popping them in the news feed at the bottom of this video. So you're welcome to email Jason and Lauren directly with any investment questions you have. As well, I'll be putting my email address down there, which is business@newzealandshores.com. So feel free to email me if you've got any questions about any of the investor visas. But yeah, that's going to be it for now. So thank you for tuning in, and we hopefully look forward to hearing from some of you in the near future. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.